Hello and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary films, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. And if you enjoy this show, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app and leave us a review and a 5-star rating. Thank you very much. In this episode, I'm going to be dipping back into the ever-expanding archive of writing on the Klassiki Journal, which you can find at klassiki.online/journal. Today, I'll be reading an essay on the Soviet-Ukrainian director Larisa Shepitko. One of the most significant female filmmakers to emerge from the Soviet system, Shepitko's career was cut short at the age of just 41, when she was killed in a car crash while location scouting for her fifth feature. Her surviving work reflects her experiences as a child of war and dislocation, and remains vital to our understanding of the post-Soviet world. Make sure to check out the links in the show description to find the original essay, to browse our collection of classic Soviet titles, and to explore some of the films mentioned in this episode. Before Russia's full-scale invasion of the country in 2022, few outside of Ukraine are likely to have heard of Bakhmut, a small city in the Donetsk region of the Donbass. By the summer of 2023, the name had become synonymous with bloodshed, after a year of brutal combat, the so-called meat grinder, into which the mercenary Wagner group poured its army of recently released convicts. A battle of attrition between occupier and occupied that utterly levelled and depopulated a 500-year-old settlement. Although it is difficult to establish with certainty, it's likely that among the countless buildings and artefacts destroyed during the war have been the birthplace of and memorials to a director called Larisa Shepitko. Perhaps the most famous daughter of Artyomovsk, as Bakhmut was known between 1924 and 2016. It was in 2016, 2 years on from the initial Russian incursion into the Donbass, that local authorities named a street in the west of the city in Shepitko's honour. In 2018, a plaque celebrating her connection to the town was installed on the walls of a cinema known as The Victory. If that name now seems grimly ironic, then so does Shepitko's connection to the site of what some have called the bloodiest military combat in Europe since the Second World War. The experience of that earlier conflict, of occupation, evacuation, and a family broken apart, sits at the heart of Shepitko's small but vital body of work. In the words of Lita Ukaderova in the introduction to a recent volume on the filmmaker, if war significantly shaped Shepitko's life, it continues to haunt her after her death. Her birth city destroyed as part of a military aggression she was unlikely to have ever imagined. Her most celebrated films, Wings and The Ascent, deal directly with the Second World War and its aftermath. But all of her surviving works are marked by a profound awareness of the preciousness and fragility of life, and the sense that the world has been knocked off its axis by forces beyond individual human control. Shepitko was born in 1938. For her, the war was a lived childhood experience, and one that was commingled with family trauma. Her father, a military officer, abandoned her mother and 2 siblings when Shepitko was an infant. In her own later recollections, she wrote, "My father fought all through the war. To me, the war was one of the most powerful early impressions. I remember the feeling of life upset, the family separated. The impression of a global calamity certainly left an indelible mark in my child's mind." Though it may veer towards armchair psychoanalysis to say so, this child's intuition of global calamity, that the world was both enchanted and on the brink of destruction, was to run like a red thread through Shepitko's artistic career. It was a sensibility that may well have found an ally in the great Alexander Dovzhenko, who was her first teacher upon enrolling in Moscow's prestigious VGIK Film School in 1954. Although Shepitko only studied with Dovzhenko for 18 months before his death in 1956, the notion that some kind of cinematic torch was passed between the two is compelling. Dovzhenko was the founding poet of Ukrainian cinema, an avant-gardist with a profound connection to his native landscapes and traditions. His greatest film, 1930's Earth, is about the transformation of Ukrainian agriculture, that is, the necessity and the grief of the passing of the old world, a distinctly Shepitko-esque theme. It's one that recurs in Poem of the Sea from 1958, directed by Dovzhenko's widow Yulia Sontseva from material prepared by the late director, and a film in which Shepitko made her acting debut. The plot, about a village being evacuated before it is flooded during the construction of a hydroelectric dam, rhymes with that of Shepitko's own unfinished final film, Farewell to Matura. Shepitko's graduation film at VGIK, 1963's Heat, is also about a world on the brink of change. Produced under the auspices of the Kyrgyz National Studio, often used in the period as a testing ground for inexperienced directors out of Moscow, the film charts generational conflict and the coming of a post-Stalinist morality to a remote farm on the Kyrgyz steppe. The production was marked by the kinds of physical extremes that would come to define Shepitko's personal and professional life. She drove her crew mercilessly, battling with heat so intense that the film stock melted in the camera, and refusing to shut down filming even when struck down with hepatitis and forced to direct from a stretcher. Instead, she called in a favour from Elim Klimov, a fellow VGIK student, to help her finish the film. They would marry 2 years later. Wings from 1966, Shepitko's breakthrough feature and perhaps her most famous, is a film about war trauma told from a peacetime perspective. In it, Nadia, played by the great Maya Bulgakova, is a fighter pilot from the Second World War who now lives a disappointingly ordinary life as a school principal in Sevastopol. Unable to connect with her students or her adopted daughter Tanya, Nadia is haunted by the loss of her lover and fellow pilot Mitya during the war. Rather than depicting catastrophe outright, Shepitko demonstrates how trauma dwells near the seemingly placid surface of post-war life. The Crimean port setting of Sevastopol was almost entirely rebuilt following the conflict, and like Nadia, it offers only the facade of stability. As in many other 60s Soviet films, like Kira Muratova's near-contemporaneous debut Brief Encounters, Wings plays with chronology, deploying flashbacks and reveries to underscore Nadia's traumatized sense of self. As one Soviet critic put it at the time, Nadia remains faithful not to the meaning of the battle, but to its external forms. But these forms have either died out or petrified, and remain only through inertia. Inertia would come to define Shepitko's career in the years that followed. Hired as one of 3 directors on the omnibus film Beginning of an Unknown Era, intended to mark the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution, she turned to the modernist author Andrei Platonov for inspiration, adapting his short story The Homeland of Electricity. Like her debut Heat, the film depicts a world ravaged by drought and poverty. But Beginning of an Unknown Era was denied a release, and Shepitko's next major project, the drama You and I from 1971, was butchered by censors in the edit. The film follows a doctor who leaves Moscow for the wilds of Siberia following an existential crisis, yet another Shepitko protagonist drawn to the peripheral and protean edges of Soviet life. The farrago surrounding the film prompted what Shepitko called a monstrous mental and physical exhaustion. Then, while recuperating in a Sochi sanatorium, she badly injured her spine in a fall. When she became pregnant shortly afterwards, she was warned that her injury meant that carrying to term could be fatal, but she chose to have the child regardless. Confined to bed and facing her own mortality, she chanced upon a novel titled Sotnikov by a Belarusian author, Vasil Bykov, and decided on her next film project. As she would later recall, all motion pictures are personal, but the desire to film The Ascent was almost a physical need. If I had not shot this picture, it would have been a catastrophe for me. The Ascent ticks all the Shepitko boxes. Brutal landscape, spiritual crisis, wartime trauma. It follows two Soviet partisans in Nazi-occupied Belarus, the wan Sotnikov and the pugnacious Rybak, who are captured by collaborating forces and faced with a mortal ethical dilemma. Filming took place in January 1974 outside Moscow, in temperatures 40 degrees below zero. Shepitko, still struggling with her spinal injury, had to be carried onto set by the actor playing Rybak, who described the shoot as a death in every frame. But, he also added, it was worth it to die in each scene in order to feel her gratitude. As a backdrop, cinematographer Vladimir Chukhnov created a physical and moral winter enveloping everything in its path. Everything that stands out against the whites of the snow is somehow broken or crooked. Black overcoats, a dead tree, burnt down houses. Why did Shepitko pursue her childlike impression of a global calamity to such extreme ends? Her personal experience notwithstanding, the director seems to have seen this dedication as a kind of moral imperative. Our most horrible ideas of what the war was like paled before the inhuman realities, she later wrote. We have tried not only to understand the pain, but to relive it. Her conviction certainly made an impression. The Ascent won the Golden Bear in Berlin, seemingly setting Shepitko up for a glorious third career act. It no doubt helped when she approached Valentin Rasputin, the author of the novel Farewell to Matura, to ask him for permission to adapt it. Rasputin was opposed to screen adaptations of his work, but Larisa managed to persuade me very quickly, as he later recalled. She was so passionate about it, so interested, that I completely forgot my intention. Yet another tale of global calamity, and one which explicitly recalled the world conjured up by Dovzhenko and Solntseva all the way back in the Poem of the Sea. Rasputin's novel concerns a small island, soon to be flooded by the construction of a hydroelectric dam, and the reluctant elderly residents who find themselves on the brink of displacement. Shepitko and 4 members of her crew were killed in a car crash in 1979 during location scouting. Klimov later completed his own version of Farewell in tribute. In the end, Shepitko's persistent evocation of the feeling of life upset, as she had put it, was an expression of empathy. Certainly her work still resonates in a world in which her hometown has experienced calamity from which it is unlikely ever to recover. And even though sacrificing oneself for art, as the injured and unwell Shepitko insisted upon doing, can't come close to the trauma she depicts on screen, the gesture implies that it's important to honour the suffering of others. One possibly apocryphal story from her career captures this. When the Soviet censors were on the verge of banning The Ascent for its heavy religious overtones, Klimov invited the first secretary of the Communist Party of Belarus, Pyotr Masharev, to an impromptu preview screening. Masharev had fought himself as a partisan in the war. In 1942, his mother was hanged by the Nazis. Masharev watched the film through tears, and afterwards delivered a 40-minute speech in the screening hall in which he is reported to have asked, "Where did this girl come from, who experienced nothing of the sort, but knows all about it?" The Ascent was accepted without further revision. That was Roads to Golgotha The War-Haunted World of Larisa Shepitko, written and read by Sam Goff. You can find this and other essays, companions and watch lists on our journal at klassiki.online/journal. Make sure to check out the links in the show description to find the original essay, to browse our collection of classic Soviet titles, and to explore some of the films mentioned in this episode. And don't forget to subscribe to this show on your podcast app, and please leave us a review and a 5-star rating to help us reach as many people as possible. Thank you.